Life in the medieval period was fragile. Sickness was a constant companion. A simple cut could lead to a deadly infection. A fever could take a child overnight. People lived with a daily awareness of their own mortality. So when they got sick, they looked for answers. Their understanding of illness was completely different from ours. It was a blend of science, faith, and superstition. To understand their remedies, we first have to understand how they thought about the body. The cornerstone of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors. This idea came from the ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and Galen. They believed the human body was made of four basic fluids, or humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to an element and a season. Blood was associated with air and springtime. It was considered hot and moist. Phlegm was linked to water and winter, seen as cold and moist. Yellow bile corresponded to fire and summer, hot and dry. And black bile was connected to earth and autumn, cold and dry. A healthy person had these four humors in perfect balance. Illness was simply a sign that one or more humors were out of sync. Too much phlegm, for example, might cause a cold or a cough because of its cold and moist nature. Or a person with too much yellow bile might be angry and feverish, reflecting the hot and dry qualities of fire. The entire goal of a medieval physician was not to kill a germ, a concept they didn't have, but to restore this delicate balance. Every remedy, from the herbs they prescribed to the food they recommended, was designed to counteract an imbalance. If a person had a fever which was a hot and dry condition, the treatment would involve something cooling and moistening. But this was only one part of the picture. Faith was just as important, if not more so. The world was seen as a creation of God, and everything that happened within it was part of a divine plan. Sickness could be a punishment for sin, it could be a test of your faith from God. Or it could be the work of the devil or evil spirits. This meant that the first step in any treatment was often spiritual, not physical. Prayer was the most common remedy of all. People prayed to God, to the Virgin Mary, and to specific saints who were patrons of certain illnesses. Saint Roch was invoked against the plague. Saint Lucy was prayed to for eye problems. A priest was as likely to be called to a sickbed as a physician. Confession and penance were seen as essential medical procedures. And if your sickness was a result of sin, then you had to get right with God before your body could heal. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were another powerful form of medicine. A sick person might travel for weeks or months to touch a holy relic, believing that this physical connection to a saint could produce a miracle cure. The line between the body and the soul was blurry. Healing one often meant healing the other. Astrology also played a huge role. The movements of the planets and stars were believed to have a direct influence on the body's humors. Physicians would consult astrological charts to determine the best time to give a medicine, perform a surgery, or even just cut a patient's hair. The position of the moon was especially important. Certain procedures were only done when the moon was in a specific zodiac sign, as it was thought to govern a particular part of the body. To a medieval mind, this wasn't superstition, it was science. The macrocosm of the heavens was directly reflected in the microcosm of the human body. And ignoring the stars would be like a modern doctor ignoring a patient's blood pressure. So when we look at the strange and sometimes shocking remedies of the Middle Ages, we have to see them through this lens. They were not just random guesses, they were logical actions based on a complex system of belief. The goal was to balance the body's fluids, appease a powerful god, and align oneself with the forces of the cosmos. Every treatment, whether it was a simple herb or a painful bloodletting, was an attempt to restore order in a world where life was unpredictable and often short. When someone fell ill in the Middle Ages, they didn't just call a single type of doctor. The world of healing was a diverse landscape, with different kinds of practitioners for different kinds of people and problems. Your access to care depended heavily on who you were, where you lived, and how much money you had. At the very top of the medical hierarchy was the university-trained physician. These were the elite. They were men who had studied at the great universities of Europe, like Salerno, Montpellier, or Bologna. They read the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates in Latin. Their practice was based almost entirely on the theory of the humors. A physician's work was intellectual, not physical. He would rarely touch a patient. Instead, he would observe, question, and diagnose. One of his most important diagnostic tools was the urine wheel. A physician would examine a patient's urine in a glass flask, holding it up to the light. He would check its color, clarity, and even smell and taste it. The urine wheel was a chart that connected different colors of urine to specific humoral imbalances and diseases. After examining the urine and consulting astrological charts, the physician would make his diagnosis. He would then prescribe a course of treatment known as a regimen. This would include detailed instructions on diet, sleep, and exercise. He would also prescribe medicines, but he wouldn't mix them himself. That was someone else's job. These physicians were expensive. They served kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants. The average peasant would likely never see one in their entire life. The next step down the ladder were the surgeons and barber-surgeons. These were the hands-on practitioners. While the physician dealt with internal medicine through theory, the surgeon dealt with the body's exterior through craft. They were skilled craftsmen, not learned academics. Their trade was passed down through apprenticeships, not university lectures. Surgeons set broken bones, stitched up wounds, removed cataracts, and performed amputations. Barber surgeons were even more common. As their name suggests, they cut hair and shaved beards, but they also performed a range of medical procedures. Their stripe pole, which we still see today, originally symbolized blood and bandages. The barber surgeon was the one you went to for bloodletting, the most common medical procedure of the age. They also pulled teeth, lanced boils, and gave enemas. Their work was messy, physical, and often painful for the patient. They were seen as less prestigious than physicians, but for most townspeople, they were the most accessible form of professional medical care. Then there was the apothecary. The apothecary was the medieval equivalent of a pharmacist. After a physician prescribed a remedy, the patient or their servant would take the prescription to the apothecary's shop. These shops were fascinating places filled with the smells of herbs, spices, and strange chemicals. They had rows of clay jars and wooden boxes filled with ingredients from all over the world. There were common herbs like lavender and rosemary, but also exotic spices from the east like pepper and cloves, and bizarre ingredients like powdered mummy or crab's eyes. The apothecary would grind, mix, and boil these ingredients to create the pills, ointments, and syrups prescribed by the physician. They also sold remedies directly to the public, offering advice for common ailments. They walked a fine line between being respected merchants and being accused of selling false cures. In the countryside, and even in cities, monastic institutions played a vital role in healthcare. Monasteries were centers of learning. Monks carefully copied and preserved ancient medical texts that might otherwise have been lost. Many monasteries had an infirmary to care for their own sick monks. They also cultivated extensive herb gardens, known as physic gardens, where they grew medicinal plants. Some monks and nuns became skilled healers, offering their services not just to those within the monastery walls, but also to the local community. For many poor people, the charity and care offered at a monastery was the only medical help they could get. Finally, and most importantly for the vast majority of the population, there were the folk healers. These were often women, sometimes called wise women. They didn't have formal training or books. Their knowledge was practical, passed down from mother to daughter through generations. They knew the local plants and their properties. They knew how to make poultices for wounds, teas for fevers, and salves for skin conditions. Their healing was intertwined with charms, prayers, and rituals. They might say a certain verse while picking an herb to increase its power. For most peasants living in a small village, the wise woman was their physician, surgeon, and pharmacist all in one. She delivered babies, treated sick animals, and eased the pain of the dying. While many were respected, they also lived in a dangerous position. If a cure failed, or if a powerful person fell ill, a folk healer could easily be accused of witchcraft. This world of healers shows that medieval medicine wasn't a single entity. It was a complex system of different traditions, skills, and beliefs, all working to combat the constant threat of illness. Once a diagnosis was made, whether by a physician studying urine or a village healer looking at a rash, the next step was the remedy itself. The medieval medicine cabinet was filled with a huge variety of substances, from common garden herbs to truly bizarre concoctions. These remedies were chosen based on the logic of the humors, traditional knowledge, and a bit of magic. For everyday problems, like headaches and fevers, the solutions were often plant-based. Fevers were seen as a sign of excess heat in the body, so treatments were designed to be cooling. A patient might be given a cool drink made with water and barley, or have cloths soaked in rose water and vinegar placed on their forehead. Herbs like rosemary and lavender were used to soothe headaches, often inhaled as smoke or made into a balm to rub on the temples. One of the most effective remedies for pain and fever came from the bark of the willow tree. People would chew on the bark or drink a tea made from it. They didn't know why it worked, of course. And we now know that willow bark contains salicin, a chemical similar to the active ingredient in aspirin. But it was a case of observation and tradition leading to a genuinely effective treatment. Coughs, colds, and sore throats were treated with things meant to soothe and break up phlegm. Phlegmum was a cold and moist humor, so remedies were often warming. A popular choice was a posset, a drink of hot milk curdled with wine or ale and sweetened with honey and spices like ginger or nutmeg. Honey itself was a key ingredient, used to soothe sore throats and suppress coughs, a practice that still holds up today. Syrups were made from herbs like horehound, which is a bitter herb that helps clear congestion, and licorice root, which soothes irritation. Thyme was another common ingredient, often boiled in water for the patient to inhale the steam. These remedies were simple, accessible, and probably offered real comfort and relief. Stomach problems were a constant issue due to spoiled food and unclean water. For indigestion or gas, people turned to aromatic herbs like mint, fennel, and chamomile. These were usually drunk as a tea. For more serious issues like intestinal worms, which were incredibly common, the treatments were much harsher. They used powerful herbs like wormwood and tansy to kill and expel the parasites. Another common approach for digestive trouble was purging. To rebalance the humors, a physician might try to violently empty the body from one end or the other. Emetics, substances that cause vomiting, were prescribed. So were laxatives made from plants like senna or rhubarb. The idea was to physically remove the excess corrupt humor that was causing the sickness. While the logic made sense to them, these harsh purges often left the patient weak and dehydrated. Treating wounds was a matter of life and death. Without an understanding of germs, infection was the biggest killer. Yet some of their methods were surprisingly effective. Wine was often used to clean wounds. The alcohol acted as a mild antiseptic, washing away dirt and killing some bacteria. After cleaning, they needed to stop the bleeding. Cobwebs were frequently pressed into a cut to help the blood clot, working much like a modern gauze. To cover the wound, they used dressings made of clean linen or a special type of bog moss called sphagnum. This moss is highly absorbent and has antiseptic properties, making it an excellent natural bandage. Honey was also applied directly to wounds. Its thick, sugary nature draws water out of bacteria, killing them, and it contains natural antibacterial agents. This made it a powerful tool against infection. One of the most fascinating remedies was the use of moldy bread. A healer might take a piece of bread that had grown a greenish-blue mold and press it into an infected wound. They were, without knowing it, applying a crude form of penicillin. They had simply observed that this particular mold seemed to help wounds heal faster. Not all remedies were so sensible. The apothecary's shelf also held many strange and exotic ingredients. One of the most famous was theriac, a complex cure-all paste that could contain over 60 ingredients. It often included things like cinnamon, opium, and most famously, the flesh of vipers. It was believed to be a universal antidote to poison and a cure for many diseases, including the plague. Another prized ingredient was powdered mummy, made from the ground up remains of ancient Egyptian mummies imported to Europe. It was thought to have powerful healing properties. Precious stones were also used as medicine. And a person might be given a powder made from ground emeralds to treat a stomach ailment, or have a sapphire held against their eyes to cure an infection. The logic here was often symbolic. Emeralds were green, the color of nature and health. Sapphires were blue, the color of the sky and purity. Animal parts were also common. A remedy for epilepsy might involve drinking a concoction made with peacock dung. A balm for baldness might contain the fat of a bear. While these seem absurd to us, they were part of a worldview where the properties of an object or animal could be transferred to the patient. It was a world of medicine built on observation, theory, and a deep belief in the hidden connections between all things. While many medieval remedies were based on herbs and diet, there was another side to their medicine. This was the world of the surgeon, a world of sharp steel, hot iron, and intense pain. These physical interventions were drastic, but they were often the only option for serious injuries, growths, or what were seen as dangerous excesses of the humors. Anesthesia, as we know it, did not exist. Patients faced these procedures with nothing more than a prayer, a shot of alcohol, or perhaps a sleep-inducing potion made from opium or mandrake root. These were unreliable and dangerous. For the most part, patients were held down and had to endure the ordeal while fully conscious. The most common medical procedure of the entire medieval period was bloodletting, also known as phlebotomy. It was used for almost every condition imaginable, from a simple fever to the Black Death. The logic was rooted directly in the theory of the four humors. If sickness was caused by an imbalance, the easiest way to correct it was to remove the humor that was in excess. Since blood was the most accessible humor, and many conditions were believed to be caused by too much of it, letting it out seemed like a perfectly logical solution. There were two main ways to perform bloodletting. The first was venesection, which involved cutting into a vein, usually on the inside of the elbow, and letting the blood flow into a bowl. Medical charts showed specific points on the body that corresponded to different organs and illnesses, guiding the surgeon on where to make the cut. The second method was leeching. Leeches, a type of freshwater worm, were placed on the patient's skin. They would attach themselves and suck out the blood. This was seen as a gentler and more targeted way to remove blood from a specific area, such as a swollen joint or a bruised eye. People of all social classes underwent bloodletting regularly, sometimes even as a preventative measure to maintain good health. While it may have occasionally reduced a patient's blood pressure, which could relieve a headache, it more often weakened an already sick person, sometimes hastening their death. Another fearsome but common tool was cautery. Cauterization involved searing the flesh with a red-hot piece of iron. It was a brutal technique, but it served several important purposes. Its primary use was to stop bleeding. In an age before complex sutures and clamps, a hot iron was the quickest way to seal the blood vessels of a major wound or an amputation stump. The intense heat would burn the tissue and create a seal, preventing the patient from bleeding to death. It was also used to treat things like hemorrhoids, skin ulcers, and even what they believed were cancerous tumors. The idea was to burn away the diseased tissue. The pain must have been unimaginable, but it was often a choice between a moment of agony and certain death from blood loss or infection. Major surgery was a last resort. It was incredibly dangerous, with a high risk of shock, bleeding, and infection. The most common major surgery was amputation. If a limb was crushed in an accident, developed gangrene, or was severely wounded in battle, the only option was to remove it. Surgeons prided themselves on their speed. A good surgeon could saw through a leg in under a minute. Speed was everything, as it minimized the time the patient spent in agony and reduced blood loss. After the limb was removed, the stump would be sealed with cautery or treated with boiling oil. Another dramatic surgical procedure was trepanation. This involved drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole into the human skull. It is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history, practiced long before the Middle Ages. The reasons for it were varied. It was sometimes used to treat skull fractures, allowing bone fragments to be removed and relieving pressure on the brain. But it was also performed for conditions like epilepsy or severe headaches. The belief was that these ailments could be caused by an evil spirit or a buildup of pressure trapped inside the head. Cutting a hole in the skull would, in theory, let it escape. Skulls found by archaeologists show that a surprising number of people actually survived this terrifying procedure. Dental care was also a surgical matter, and it was just as basic and painful. There were no fillings or root canals. The primary solution for a painful tooth was extraction. This was usually done by a barber surgeon or an itinerant tooth puller at a market fair. Using a fearsome-looking tool called a dental pelican, which looked like a pair of pliers with a claw, they would clamp onto the tooth and rip it out. There was no pain relief, and the risk of breaking the jaw or causing a serious infection was high. For most people, living with chronic dental pain was preferable to facing the tooth puller. These physical interventions highlight the desperation and the courage of both the medieval patient and the practitioner. They were working with a limited understanding of the body, but they were not afraid to take bold, if brutal, action in the face of suffering and death. Looking back at medieval remedies, it's easy to dismiss them as a collection of superstitions and barbaric practices. We see the bizarre ingredients, the reliance on astrology, and the brutality of bloodletting and surgery, and we might call it a dark age of medicine. But that's not the full story. The question we have to ask is, did any of it actually work? The answer is complicated. It was a mix of things that were genuinely helpful, things that were actively harmful, and things that worked for reasons they could never have understood. First, we can't underestimate the power of the placebo effect. In an age of deep religious faith, the belief that a treatment would work was incredibly powerful. A patient who confessed their sins, prayed to a saint, and received a remedy from a trusted healer or a learned physician truly believed they were on the road to recovery. This psychological reassurance can have a real physiological effect. It can reduce stress, ease pain, and boost the body's own ability to heal. The ritual and authority of the healer, whether it was a priest's blessing or a physician's complicated chart, played a huge role in a patient's outcome. Believing you were being cared for by both man and God was a potent form of medicine in itself. Beyond the placebo effect, some of their remedies were genuinely effective, even if their reasoning was wrong. As we've seen, the use of willow bark for pain and fever was effective because it contains a natural anti-inflammatory. Applying honey and certain types of mold to wounds were effective antiseptic and antibiotic treatments. Using sphagnum moss as a wound dressing was a smart choice due to its absorbent and mildly antiseptic qualities. Cleaning wounds with wine helped prevent infection. Many of the herbs used for digestive issues like mint and chamomile are still used today to soothe the stomach. Their knowledge of herbal medicine was based on centuries of trial and error. People observed what worked and passed that knowledge down. They didn't need to know about chemical compounds. They just needed to know that a tea from a certain leaf eased a cough. However, many of their most common practices were incredibly harmful. Bloodletting is the most obvious example. Routinely draining blood from a person who was already sick from an infection or malnutrition would only make them weaker. It would compromise their immune system and could lead to shock or even death. The harsh purges and emetics used to rebalance the humors could cause severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, which could be fatal, especially for the very young or very old. Some of the ingredients in their remedies were also toxic. Mercury and arsenic were sometimes used as medicines, slowly poisoning the patient they were meant to cure. And of course, surgery without proper anesthesia or knowledge of germs was a horrific and often deadly gamble. But to judge medieval medicine solely by our modern standards is to miss the point. It was not a period of stagnation, it was a time of transition. Monks in monasteries painstakingly preserved the medical knowledge of the ancient world, which formed the basis for the Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed. The medieval period also saw the establishment of the first hospitals in Europe. These were often charitable institutions run by the church, and while their focus was as much on spiritual care as physical healing, they were the first organized places dedicated to caring for the sick. The medieval concept of a healthy regimen paying close attention to diet, exercise, sleep, and your environment is surprisingly modern. Physicians understood that what you ate and how you lived had a direct impact on your health. They advised moderation and balance. This holistic approach, which sees the patient as a whole person living in a specific environment, is something modern medicine is only now beginning to appreciate again. Medieval medicine was a system built on its own logic. It was an attempt to make sense of the world and the frailties of the human body using the tools they had: ancient philosophy, religious doctrine, and practical observation. It was a world where prayer and a poultice were part of the same treatment. While many of their methods were misguided and dangerous, they were not random. They were the best efforts of people trying to heal others in a world full of suffering. They laid a foundation, preserving knowledge and creating institutions that would, centuries later, evolve into the medicine we know today.